So we're getting together now for the third time of our discussion of Marx's book, Capital, at least the first volume of the book. And we will engage in a discussion about value as it is addressed in section 2 of chapter 1. And what we'll do is we'll divide the discussion. The next hour, we'll divide it in 4 sections. The first 15 minutes or so, Matt, we'll talk about the stuff of the book in this particular section. And then what we'll do in the next 30 minutes is we'll divide those next 30 minutes in 2 sections. The first 15 minutes of that second of that time period, we'll talk a little bit about the strangely named stimulus check, and then I'd like to kind of fit that discussion about the stimulus check, if we can, Matt, about labor and the experiences of labor, and labor as is done in the agricultural industry, and then labor as is done in urban industries, with special attention, of course, to the experiences of Chicana and Chicano workers, Mexican workers in places like Central Valley of California and the metropolitan region of Los Angeles. And then we'll finish our discussion, Matt, with a Q&A section, the last 15 minutes or so, where we'll take questions if some are posed to us and answer them, and then you and I discuss the implications of this work more generally beyond the initial parameters of our discussion, the first 45 minutes, and then kindly, Matt, you'll close with a recital, sharing excerpts of your poetic work, giving substance to the title of our weekly engagements, El Profesor y el Poeta, the professor and the poet, okay? Orbiting the work, of course, of Karl Marx. What do you think?
I think that sounds like what we should do. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, I want to begin with a bit of reference to Eduardo Galeano. Rafael Avitia, welcome from the Central Valley. I will be giving some attention to your region today. Anyway, I read some time ago, and I don't recall which of the books in particular, but I read one of Galeano's books some time ago, where he identifies that it isn't diarrhea, or tuberculosis, or even malnutrition that is the disease that afflicts Latin America. He writes very convincingly that the disease is in fact capitalism, and drawing from that position, if capitalism is the disease, and if those who infect are the capitalists, then the crime of these capitalists is social murder. And And I came across a meme recently on Facebook, and I'd never seen it before, and so I looked it up. And uh, to understand it, this concept of social murder, and I'd like to share it with you, Matt, so that we can begin our discussion about Chapter 1, Section 2. And by the way, Chapter 1, Section 2 is titled The Twofold Character of the Labor Embodied in Commodities. Mm-hmm. So the quote reads, "When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians, workers, in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder. Just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised malicious murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is because no man sees the murderer, because the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission, but the murder, it remains." I hope I haven't, by your granting me the opportunity to quote this, I hope I haven't strayed too far away from what we intend to do today.
No, I don't think so. I think that's really a great thing, because when we're talking about this kind of omission or what is denied to us, or this kind of this thing is a little different than what we were talking about in the previous discussions, when we were talking about what we call what Marx will describe as the primitive capital accumulation, right? Which just means early levels of like this the institutionalizing of this terrible moment, right? This horrible thing. Then now we're talking about generations later being born into it. We're talking about being born into it, and this being the way of life. And as a way of life, you're not really lied to because you're not promised anything. So because you're not promised anything, the result is still the same. You're born, you live, and you die under these conditions. I think that really, what Galeano is describing, really describes that. I think what sets the kind of stage for us today in reading Chapter 1, Section 2 is this real interesting kind of distinction that Marx was making between, or that can be made. I think because people don't. The way people talk today, they kind of use terms interchangeably. Between this concept of labor and labor power, right? The labor and labor power are different from each other. Like your labor is actually like the kinetic moment that you're doing something, right? Like right now, you and I, in some aspects, might be laboring, right? We're working, right? But it's not. Our ability to work is separate from the actual work as it's happening, right? So that is kind of, so for instance, people don't really sell their labor. They labor. They sell their labor power, right? Now, another more common 2020 American English way of saying that is ability. Your ability to labor, right? So to make things clear to people, we're talking about your ability to do something, like the labor power. That's kind of a weird 1800s English way of saying it, but labor ability, your labor power, your ability to do a thing, right? And so that is what we go and sell as proletariat on the market, as our ability to labor. And I think that he talks over and over and over again about labor power. So that's what that means. And why it's distinct. And I know that sounds kind of weird and like kind of wonky, but if you don't make that distinction, you're going to make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah. Well, it's
a lot of mistakes down, on that mathematical chalkboard. You're going to make a lot of mistakes if you don't make a distinction between labor power and labor, because you don't sell your labor. You don't imbue a commodity with your labor power either. You know what I'm saying? You don't imbue a commodity with your ability to do a thing. You imbue it with the doing of the thing,
with your blood, tears,
with your blood, sweat, and tears, right? So if you don't, but it's not your ability to bleed. You're not your ability to sweat. And you're not your ability to cry. It is that actually that. But what you sell to your employer is your ability to bleed, your ability to sweat, your ability to cry. What keeps you alive is to be able to convince someone who owns the means of production, or who owns a piece of the means of production, or as the gatekeeper to the means of production, that you can bleed, sweat, and cry, right? So those are a little distinct from one another, and I think in section 2, chapter 1, he makes those distinctions it makes that you have to be able to make that distinction in order to really understand what he's saying.
I want to add a couple things to what you're talking about. One of the important concepts or understandings, anyway, that I extract from the reading is this observation, this foundational observation made in this particular portion of the book, where he distinguishes humanity from other entities on the planet for humanity's ability to not just involve themselves in the material world, but to distinguish themselves as human beings by way of their capacity to work and to do such whatever work whatever work humanity engages, for that work to require interaction and involvement with the natural world around humanity. And so that is one premise that's very important, not just for our discussion today of this particular section, but it's a premise that is foundational for the rest of the book, of course, given as Marx was to draw attention to the relationship between workers and capitalists, right? And so that there's a second premise that is very illuminating for me, and I hope that I can share its share its luminosity appropriately. Maybe that's not the right to use right now, but anyway, if you think about it, then if capitalism, right, if capitalism and capitalists have as their task the colonization of the work of humanity, and then of course the buying and selling of workers as commodities, then the fact is that capitalism in general and capitalists in particular, and of course you and I know that capitalists have a first and last name, right? Then what capitalism and capitalists do is they usurp the very distinction that makes us human beings. capitalism and capitalists, to the extent that they put us as workers and as commodities in a line of production and in a line of consumption, they have in fact stolen our humanity. I wonder what you might say about this, Matt.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think Marx describes it as a stultifying division of labor, right? And like the key word there is stultifying. I mean, what are we talking about, right? We're talking about being turned into these like kind of like animatrons that kind of like do a task, carry out the task, finish the task, and that is who we are and designed to be under the system. I think it's interesting though that when Karl Marx described alienation, and he described on the in a technical capacity, I think that there's a universal truth to what he said, and it goes throughout the ages. But then the kind of social aspects of it, where people are, like one day it's a cobbler, the next day you're on a line doing something, and you lose all the charm of having known exactly how to go from beginning to end, and you're just kind of like, part of this line of production. I think people began to internalize that later. I mean, like if you look at like, movies and stuff that came out of the 60s and 70s, or even 50s. I mean, you see people like kind of internalizing the rhythms of factory life and loving it, and then because they drew meaning from it. They drew meaning from being in a factory with your factory brothers and this kind of thing like that. So I think that people, eventually within a generation or something like that, they internalize the way of the world in those kinds of in that kind of way. So there is a kind of we end up socializing around a certain kind of technological base. We draw our identity from that, right? So that's kind of what it is. I think that what really distincts. I mean, this is just me talking now. What I really think that distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom is our ability to build upon what the last generation built, right? So like, for instance, like like squirrels have been around the earth for like 30 million years or something like that, right? Then squirrel life hasn't changed in 30 million years other than the presence of human beings driving it somewhere else, right? Human life isn't what it was 30 years ago. And the reason is that because things change between each generation. The reason things change between generations is we have the ability to build on what the last generation did. And there's really only two forms by which that happens, I believe, is the development of language and tools, right? Because we pass down, in mathematics as well. So our the development of our understanding, so that's like language and mathematics, and the development of the tools that we build our lives around, right? Which are the means of production, but also these things that under capitalism are commodity, but in reality is technology, right? Or and their use value is just technology. So the fact that you and I are having this conversation on a computer, the computer is going on to social media, all like that, not possible 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So this type of conversation will be happening with a different means, requiring different people to get here, to get this information out differently, right?
Yeah.
So but in doing that, that would create a whole other thing. So, and when technology arrives, the social impact isn't immediately felt. It takes a while for it to reconfigure around, okay, this new kind of thing, right? So without this social media, the old way of doing things would be like, I am the expert. I am standing before you. Here we are here in this room, and you had to pay a lot of money to be here. And if you didn't see it live, you wouldn't see it at all, right? Or be on a tape or video cassette, but not this kind of stuff, right? So that's kind of like how things still are in a way, because there still are professors, there still are colleges, there still are expert seminars, there still are those things, right? But this is chipping away at it. And within 20, 30, 40 years, this is going to be the thing. And that is going to be very boutique. That is going to be very, that's not going to be the thing that most people do. It's not going to be the most prevalent way of communicating information, So like if you see something happening in, like, let's say 1985, and it happens 3 or 4 times, then you see something out of 10. Then by 1990, it's going to happen, 7 out of 8. And then by 2010, that thing you're talking about is a thing of the past, like a travel agent or something. Like when we went to Cuba, that was the first time I talked to a travel agent in my adult life. part of like that's not a part of what I do. And
Yeah.
it was only because going to Cuba is such a specialized boutique kind of thing.
So regulated.
So regulated, so that you have to go through like right? So like, you know, but I would never go to if I wanted to just go to Mexico or I wanted to fly somewhere to Mexico, I would never have to go through a travel agency. I didn't want to if I would. It would be probably hard to find.
What your observation gives us an opportunity to highlight in this particular reading is his discussion of the social divisions of labor and the increased complexity and increased divisions of society as history proceeds and as technological advancements in production present themselves and are introduced in society, such that where in the absence of technology, the divisions in society are less complex. You know, as time evolves, divisions increase, and even the lines, the various lines of production of commodity production in society diversify, and so this gives us an opportunity to get back to something that you were talking about earlier, Matt, and this gives us an opportunity to talk about labor power and then labor itself, right? So that labor power, as you identify, right, is the capacity to use our brain, to use our muscle, to use our limbs, right, in practices of production, be those practices of production for particular use values, right, or be those practices of production for the production of use values that capitalists can usurp and put on the market as exchange values for themselves to generate profit, to effectively steal workers' labor. So that's the first kind of premise, if you will, as far as labor power is concerned. But the concurrent and corresponding understanding of labor power, of course, is or in fact abstract labor, is this discussion and this notion of concrete labor, which is also something that you were bringing up in your previous discussion, Matt, when you were talking about the actual kinetic involvement, right? So that as society increasingly divides, and as we find ourselves in separate slots to produce the commodities, whatever those commodities might be that the capitalist, puts out in the market, we engage in very particular activities, activities that are distinct across regions. A labor that is distinct across regions, and even labor that is not just distinct across regions, but even in the context of a particular factory, right? So that all these divisions surface as history proceeds. I'm summarizing, the stuff of this particular book, that is introduced, and of course, by way of our exchange, so are you, summarizing some of the stuff that we've been reading in this book so far. I think that now is a good time to switch gears a bit, Matt, and for us to talk about this stuff in relevant. Welcome, Steve. Welcome, Amanda. I'm sorry. Welcome, Daryl. Welcome, Rafael. Welcome to the discussion. I think it's now's time to make our discussion of this particular section of the book to make it relevant as far as the historical moment, the viral moment as it were. And you shared with me earlier, Matt, that you are interested to talk about the stimulus check. Won't you tell us a little bit about the stimulus? What is it? And then what is your understanding and critique of this stimulus check?
Well, no, I don't know if I necessarily have to tell people about the possibility that they're going to get $1,200. I think that's a pretty well publicized fact.
Yeah.
Wondering
Yeah.
when and if that's going to happen, how that's going to happen, and what's going on with that. But it is really interesting to look at that. And in preparation for this, I think I actually read chapter 2 because I thought we were doing that, but chapter 2 1, but now it's chapter 1, section 2. But
Yeah.
But not to jump ahead to the book, but it really did talk about what money is. So regardless, because there's all this conversation about like how what is this going to look like when we get this money? Like how are they going to make this money? I mean, it's a question of American politics. How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And yet they're able to pay for all these different things, and then all of a sudden and anytime that happens, you always get the liberal kind of left wing section of Capital always saying. I mean, somebody always says like, well, we're just going to print a coin. We're going to mint $1 trillion coin.
Yeah.
They're always talking about mint the trillion. This time, I think it was Tlaib, Rashida Tlaib. I think the woman who got Conyers seat. And so she was now talking about minting a coin. In the past, it's been others talking about minting a coin. So there's always the idea of minting a coin, and then you get the libertarians get all up in arms like, you can't just can't just print a coin and people in general also like, you can just print a coin. I mean, there's a big question mark that goes over their head. But regardless of the bizarre machinations of just printing $1 trillion and throwing it on the market and seeing what happens, money itself is actually representative of labor. I mean, it draws its ability to be printed. Theoretically, I mean, like, or just in general, right? The reason this is an aberration, just printing money out of nowhere, is because generally speaking, the way it came into the world is that it is representative of labor.
Yeah.
And this is why Marx referred to this as kind of like dead labor, like money is dead labor and it can only. I got this from somebody. Daryl actually helped me with this when he said, it's in Capital. He talks about it living off of living labor, like a vampire sucking the blood out of living labor. That is dead labor, and that is the money that we exchange with one another. So in many ways, yeah. I mean, it expresses itself in many, many ways. I mean, the idea that this capital, and especially in this moment, is really a death cult. But even outside of just the moment we're in, you have like dead presidents, right? Dead presidents representing. But you also have the reality that it is dead labor, and we're supposed to die for it, and it's not without its own horrific poetry. The way Capital actually works. So that's what I just wanted to get into, the fact that they're printing all this money, but money does somehow tie back to our labor, and the fact that they can just do it. It's going to have its effect on the system they run. I mean, they always talk about, like, you see, like, more economic people there that they're kind of mouthpieces for the capitalist order of things. They often say, well, if we dump all this money on the market, and they give you a long, convoluted chalkboard thing of what's going to happen, and they may be right, because according to the market system, if you have all this money that's not somehow at some point tied to labor, you're going to have a crash. You have liberal economics professors like Krugman or Reich talking about, they were very upset in the previous years describing the system of derivatives in the stock market, which were like these kind of reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections of reflections, eventually getting to capital. There were bets on bets on bets on bets on bets on bets, right? To the point where you had a derivative economy that was something like 14 times the size. I think it was something like 14, or it was like 10 to 14 size of the gross world product. So you had all these things, bets on bets on bets on bets on bets, that eventually, finally tied back to a commodity, right? that somebody could draw its value from. But the commodity itself draws its value from labor. So it's like the commodity itself is already a bet on a bet on a bet, right? But then this was a bet on 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 a bet, and it still is. It still is. We still live in a world economy that is a bunch of bet on a 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 bet, and that's what's really keeping things afloat. Because in many ways, so much of value has been removed because so many workers have been removed from the production line, right? And they're thrown into what's called the service economy. They're thrown into gig economy. Thrown into this, but they're not actually thrown into the actual production of, like, this glass bottle.
Yeah.
Because so many of those jobs have been mechanized, and there's just so many fewer people that work at the point of production that the question of value is becoming very, very tenuous.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to say also, I want to also, just like you, extend a welcome to everybody, and also to those just joining us. If you post a question in the last 15 minutes or so, we will respond to questions and conversations, and
we look forward to that.
Yeah.
And all questions are received, and all questions, given time constraints, of course, will be addressed from wherever you want to pose the question, from whatever position you are disposed to question us in this conversation, and question one another, of course. So, go ahead.
I said even the snotty questions.
Yes, exactly. We really like those. We really like those. So, taking us back to this question of the stimulus check, and then looking to transition into a discussion that I think will be relevant for folks like Rafael Avitia from the Central Valley, and of course, Central Valley of California, the agricultural center of the planet, as I understand it. As a matter of fact, it is the so-called breadbasket to the world. Breadbasket, the so-called bakers in this breadbasket, of course, are Mexican, disproportionately Mexican. But we'll talk about this in just a second. This stimulus check, printed as it is to be printed out of thin air, Matt. As you explained a few moments ago, leads me to draw a conclusion about social murder. And it's, if you'll give me a second, I'll link these things in a way that I hope makes sense, and gives me an opportunity, and gives us an opportunity to talk about Mexican workers, Chicana and Chicano workers in the agricultural industry of the Central Valley. If the stimulus check is conjured by way of some kind of economic and political hocus pocus, right, in this particular time, then what that means is that there is a particular bet, drawing on the kind of stuff that you're talking about, Matt. And the bet is that there will be workers to consume. There will be workers that will be consumed and integrated in the incorporated within the various commodities that they produce. And of course, if we're talking about commodity production in the Central Valley, we're talking about oranges, we're talking about apple, not apple, we're talking about peaches, nectarines, grapes, etc. We're talking about fruits, and the fruit and vegetables that are marketed across the nation and across the planet. In any case, what must be done then to consume labor, right, is to engage them in activities about which Engels wrote about, activities of that lead to their social murder, right? And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of this stuff. We know, for instance, We know, for instance, recently that though the but though society and society's institutions in this particular moment have classified Mexican workers in places like the Central Valley, have classified them and have classified us as essential workers, there exists this strange contradiction. Well, strange if you are justice minded, but a very quote unquote logical, quote unquote rational condition where at least when we see things from the perspective of the capitalist class, the strange condition whereby on the one hand Mexican work is essential work, and yet on the opposite side of the very same coin, if you will, the very same mint, if you will, Matt, the work continues to be illegal. And being illegal, of course, subjects Mexican workers in the Central Valley, particularly the undocumented ones, right, who make up the bulk of the workforce in the agricultural industry, makes them subject to all kinds of repressive and exploitative and oppressive conditions that have in fact led to the death of some of them, either on the field, by way of sun exposure to heat, for instance, or once people have been corralled, once these workers have been corralled and caged, some of them have been victimized deliberately or victimized by way of disease and infection that circulates in these cages in which they have been corralled. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think that right now we're talking about this. I remember seeing this meme that came out not too long ago, and it showed like essential worker being these people working in the fields and non-essential worker being the selfie from the Oscars, right? And the funny thing about this was that this meme was produced by Turning Point USA, and it was supposed to be this right-wing meme about anti-Hollywood. They're not important. What really matters is America's heartland, the farmers, da da da. But this meme ended up getting taken up by a lot of like Chicanos and Mexicanos and all kinds of people like that, right? Because we all know who works the field, right?
Yeah,
so this of like the American farmer, right, or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. I remember this.
It is like is what Turning Point USA was selling, but the people who actually saw that, and the farmer's like little, he's like a small guy in a big giant field, right? So you can't really see him. So what ended up getting taken up by was people who were proponents of hey, like we make up the backbone of the agricultural work in this country, and we need to be honored, as opposed to what they were trying to say. So that was really funny to me. But yeah. I think that's really interesting that there's this consciousness that we have in the world, that what really matters is the people that put their hands in the soil and make food, because you can't eat a widget, right? So this, like, despite hundreds of years of industrial production, despite all the machinations of capitalism and its imperialist exploits, there's still this basic human knowledge that you can't eat a car, that you can't eat a suit, that you can't eat these things, that you need people to put their hands in the ground and grow food, and that needs to be honored, right? And people need to pull the food, and that needs to be honored in some type of rhetorical way, some spiritual way. I mean, people don't want to pay anybody anything, but there has to be some understanding that is an important thing that should be honored, that it kind of sticks with us in our consciousness. So that's kind of interesting how it runs into its absolute hypocrisy and contradiction when you start talking about, like, well, then how should we structure society? I think that's the first thing that comes to mind. Because when we talk about this food thing, we still live in a capitalist world. I mean, the food, what we need to live, is still a commodity. I mean, and when we talk about this, it's not just in one country. I mean, food is exported, imported all throughout the world. right? And so now this was really interesting to me is like, I remember doing we were talking about things yesterday. We were talking, or last time we were talking, and when we were talking about um, when we're talking about the when we're talking about like countries that they import and export.
Yeah, yeah.
Like I remember like years ago doing this research, finding out that Thailand was the biggest exporter of rice in the world, and that the Philippines was the number one importer. Right. So at the time I did the research, that was true. Now I look back, I find out the number one importer of rice in the world is now China.
Yeah.
China is the biggest importer of rice in the world. The number two biggest import for corn in the world is Mexico.
Yeah.
And it's barely behind Japan. It's barely behind Japan. It's like I think it's like 2.3 billion for Japan, 2.2 for Mexico or something like that.
Yeah.
Barely behind Japan. So Mexico is very, very close to being the number one importer of corn in the world. Now the Chinese do not need to be importing rice in order to be able to produce rice and enough.
Yeah.
There's enough rice for Chinese people. Mexico does not need to import corn for there to be enough corn for Mexican people, right? So this is just the system of food is not outside the bounds of capitalist exchange. Yeah. It's not outside of that, right? And so that's kind of interesting. Now, when you speak specifically about the role of undocumented workers within essential labor of food production in the United States of America, now that gets really interesting because now we're talking about, especially when you begin to look at the core of it, which is this Mexicano labor base, right? That has its own particular history. And again, that is kind of the purpose of a lot of what we do, which is to like historicize that particular history within its own context. Because what people happens in this country, and it's not just on this question, it's on virtually every question to deal with Mexicanos, Chicano people, is to take whatever their current condition is and historicize it in someone else's history.
Yeah.
To place in someone else's history. So we talk about the role of people here, then all of a sudden we're talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, we're talking about this, we're talking about this, we're talking about that, we're talking about Ellis Island, we're talking about sharecroppers in the South. We're talking about anything but the history of this particular group of people who find themselves in these particular conditions. And to look at that history is to see the history of Mexican labor within the United States of America always being this question of exploitation coupled with expulsion.
Yeah.
Coupled with get out.
Yeah, these are the ruthless circumstances of capitalist terror that we were talking about some time ago.
The ruthless circumstance of capitalist terror as played out in this specific group of people.
Yes.
Which is not to say similar things haven't happened to other groups of people, but there's a specific line of history that this group of people find themselves in. Right now, it can be said that regionally there were other workers as well, and there was this and this. Well, those are also specific histories that play to specific groups of people as well. But this particular thing, this question that we're looking at right here, has a very particular history, a very specific history, and to understand it, it has to be examined. So we can't just say, "Well, America has always been this way. Look what they did to this other group of people, X, Y, and Z." No. You have to look at the specific history of what we're talking about here, right? And so we're talking about this history that's rooted in the Mexican-American War. It's rooted in the Mexican Repatriation Act. It's rooted in the fact that the Bracero program, as well as Operation Wetback, are overlapping. This is always a question of the control of Mexican labor in an area that used to be Mexico, and you control it by expelling the people. You don't belong here. Like you don't belong here. You are the people that do not belong here. Get to work.
Be consumed. Yeah, you're to be consumed and spit out, expelled.
Right, and just so people don't think that I'm just talking about this abstractly.
Yeah,
My great grandfather was a coal miner in Colorado, and he was deported during the Mexican Repatriation Act. I mean, he was forced out. I mean, the history, the family history is a little sketchy on this, but they had to leave in the 1930s, and took my grandfather and all my uncles who were all born here in the United States of America had to leave, had to go to Mexico in the 1930s. During that period of time, and he came here. He worked the coal mines of Colorado, and he died. He died about a year younger than I am now, because of complications due to being a coal miner. But he died in Mexico. having obtained, all kinds of issues, health issues here in the United States of America.
His lungs were consumed in the caverns in Colorado. They were
Yes.
consumed, and the caverns spit him out. It's interesting that you bring this up. If I could be a bit pretentious here, and also share with you that I too have that my grandfather was also a miner, right? And he was a miner in U.S. mining companies. In Mexico, in the northern states of Durango and Chihuahua. And he shared with me before his death, and he was approaching 100 years old about 20 years ago when he passed away. He shared with me that he was witness to drownings and cave-ins, etc., where these caves consume, workers, miners, and those whose relatives are lucky are able to extract them from these caves, because some of them are still some of them are still in the valley of the capitalist caves in northern Mexico. But in any case, we're in the last 10-minute segment, Matt.
Yeah, and we got lots of questions.
And we've got some cool questions and some cool discussion going on. So I want to thank you. I appreciate this from the bottom of my heart. Everybody, Matt, of course, I want to thank you for this work that we're doing together. I'm really excited about it. I think it's really exciting. And I do want to close our discussion in a few minutes and with a recitation or the recital of one of your poems or excerpt of one of your poems in a way that would encapsulate the discussions that we're having. But we've got a whole bunch of questions, and we've got a lot of commentary. And I want to begin with one that I see here. It says, and this is from San Yewan Ipalnemoa. San Yewan Ipalnemoa. He writes, does the latent capitalist exist in the definition of the individual? The elotero is the ultimate capitalist. He or she owns the means of distribution. Well, I don't know. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Can exploit his own labor power, retains the maximal profit. Well, of course, this understanding, San, from my reading and interpretation of the work, seems to divorce the elotero from the historical conditions of his or her labor. But in any case, San writes, my question is, does the capitalist fail when it becomes an ideology, when it is extended outside the maximal social individual? We'll stop there. What do you think, Matt? What do you think about that?
Well, I think in order for the elotero to be a capitalist, and what we're describing, right?
Yeah.
And not only a producer who sells whatever, right? So for instance, me, like I'm like an artisan because I have my ability to do a thing, and I sell it in the market, right? So I'm not necessarily a capitalist. See, for me to be a capitalist, what I would need is an army of workers who are living off the backs of. You know what I'm saying? I would need to like have them work, and because they were working, I didn't have to work. I mean, I could show up with a suit and a tie to a desk somewhere, but that's not really why I was making money. I was making money because they're out making money for me, running it. Yeah. So that because of their labor, I'm still making money. So that's kind of what we're talking about. What we're describing as capitalist is to live off of that capital, is to live off of that extraction that we're living at. So an elotero, unless they have a fleet of eloteros, and they're like they're sitting at a desk, and whatever they do that day does not matter. They're going to make that money because other eloteros are out there. In their blood, sweat, and tears, then that elotero is not necessarily a capitalist in the sense that we're talking about. I don't really know how to describe what I do. I mean, I think maybe I'm petty bourgeois, or I'm an artisan, or something like that.
We are the petty bourgeois.
I think so. I mean, and I don't like say that like with some guilt. I don't say that with whatever, because there are a lot of people who are. No, I mean, there's a lot of people who are quote unquote proletariat. Who make a lot more money than I do, because being petty bourgeois doesn't necessarily mean I'm rich or I'm like small rich or small whatever. But I don't take any like I don't feel any guilt about it. But it's a technical. Technically I'm outside the bounds of that. Like my work isn't making anybody else rich. You know what I mean? Like it really isn't. Like I live off college honorarium, so I you know what I mean, like that's like an accounting error for these giant institutions. It's
Yeah.
not like, you know, our college is so great because we're bringing this guy here and now we're going to increase enrollment. But I mean, I wish I was quite sure what I am in my
Yeah.
career. That's I'm not really a proletarian in that sense, and I'm also not. I'm a proletarian that I have to work, but I'm not like a worker in the sense that I'm like an Amazon worker, and I'm not. But I'm also not a capitalist. I'm not also not like
Yeah.
living off the Amazon workers. So it's kind of you know, like, and I would say an Elitero is in a very similar in kind of same position. Like they're selling their stuff. You know, they're selling what they produce.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily own.
I think that there's a subtext, or rather a premise in San's question, and it concerns our identification and our forced, if you will, affinity with a system, the very system that depends upon our consumption. And I think that this is a good way to think about the relationship between the economy and workers. That is that, in fact, Freire also in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I don't mean to name drop, like this. It's just that I first came across this contemplation when I read that book, and that contemplation is always stuck in the back of my mind. That is that we identify with he who is our oppressor when we misrecognize and are not critical of the context of our existence, and when we don't work to undermine the context of our existence, when we don't work to undermine our exploitation. And so I think that what San is addressing is not so much the fact that San will correct me today or next week. I think what San is addressing is that, in a sense, we come to see ourselves and we come to see one another much in the same way that we are perceived. It's not to say that we have the same faculties and capacities to oppress one another as the capitalist class has the capacity to oppress us. It's just that, our epistemology, our ideology, our perspectives, our interpretation of the world is one that we did not forge. And we've internalized it as it has internalized us to produce for it.
Well, I think it's absolutely true that that's absolutely true that people have a tendency to internalize bad ideas that are designed to oppress them. But I also think it's really true that what we think about the world and what the world actually is, though sometimes overlap, are very distinct, are very different from one another. So no matter what you think, there is the world out there, right?
Yeah.
So whether or not you grasp it correctly, incorrectly, or whatever, it still exists. So our consciousness does not determine our position.
Yeah.
Just because I think a certain way, I mean, I am a certain way. I could think I'm like,
we could talk about identity politics. Yeah. Matt, we're at we're on the home stretch. Do you want to continue conversation a bit, or what do you want to do?
Well, I want to address something someone else said though. I want to address there was another comment in here. I think that's worth exploring. I think a few people actually saw Benjamin Wood and Martha Rivas's comments before I kind of saw Zan, so I didn't really know. I was like, what? Like, but the other comment here that's not related to that is Michael Novick saying there are billions still producing value, just not the U.S. consumer society because of the export of capital.
Yeah.
So there's a world of proletariat out there still working that have not, that the world's not the U.S. and that there is that there are well, I'm just taking what I'm taking from this, but the world is not the U.S. And just because we can look at U.S. and see like factory work, let's say the auto industry being decimated by automation and various other industries being decimated by automation, and the fact that automation is looming over the head of different aspects of American industry does not mean that that's happening evenly throughout the world. And I think that's absolutely true. But at the same time, I think that capital describes a world of labor, not just pockets or regions of labor, or just it talks about a world of labor and how commodities draw their value from that world of labor that exists, the labor power, I should say, world of labor power that is kind of exists in relationship to each other and can be, we have to take these into consideration. And what I'm describing with automation is not an event; it's a process. It's an unfolding process. It keeps going on and on and on and on and on and on. The old way of doing things that we can kind of identify as kind of the heyday of American capital, or at least the American working class and its relationship to capital, sometimes called Fordism, is dead. That's dead. That's dead. And the process of that dying will be felt in other countries in different ways. So, most of what we're describing with automation happens within like kind of the imperialist core of the world. So like what it's happening in the United States, it's happening in Japan. I mean, Japan. I mean, it's happening more in Japan than it's happening here. And in Japan, you see a situation where the workforce out there has the number one turnover rate in the entire world. People having jobs for like 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. Where, we have a pretty high turnover rate here in America of like working for a job for 2 years, 3 years. But that's expedited in Japan. And I can't say that. I can't. I mean, the reason I would tie that to is the fact that Japan has far more what do you call them? CNCs, computer network control per capita. Machines that make machines, right? Than we do here in the United States. And so because of that, you see its effect on the economy. And then, it goes into the economy, then it gets into socially, which, I'm not from Japan. I haven't lived in Japan. I'm not Japanese. I can't really speak to it too much, but I know kind of from an outside perspective that's having a devastating effect on how people conceive of themselves in the country of Japan. It goes from like being able to hold a job and feeling secure in your work to like now the uncertainty and you're going to be ejected as soon as you get in. That's having a devastating effect on how people conceive of themselves and the way that they relate to the world around them.
Yeah. It's one of the it's in the work that I do, of course. I talk about it with folks as I talk about it with my students when I'm doing work in the classroom. Hovering as technology and technological quote unquote advance is over my work with them and threatening it as it is. We talk about our position, that is the angles of our body, the placement of our bodies, in particular structures, be the structures metallic desks in which we sit, for instance, or brick and mortar boxes in which those desks find themselves, right? And then the corresponding dispositions, perspectives, affinities, inclinations, and disinclinations, even repulsions that we have, given our socialization within these particular positions. And so we acquire perspectives, we acquire identities and identifications under the constrictions in which, or by way of the constrictions in which we exist, constricted as we often are from understanding the world around us. And so that we ascribe, I hope I'm not speaking legalese as it were here, but we begin to ascribe to notions about one another, notions about ourselves that are disingenuous, that are in fact, later on in the book, we'll read about fetishizations that are, in a sense, fetishizations, abstractions divorced from the real circumstances of our existence.
Before we get to the last part, Martha Rivas here says these are forced ideas through public schooling. The premise of education is to assimilate to the dominant ideologies. Let us not forget, and that's absolutely true. I mean, like the way this system is, it encourages us twofold: one to be cruel to others, and two to be delusional about ourselves. It produces a workforce. It produces a whole generations of people who are cruel and delusional, right? They're cruel to others. They like hey, work or starve, buddy. And they think about themselves like, I believe I'm a capitalist. I'm a, and they can't even, living paycheck to paycheck, talking about how they're a capitalist. So it creates people who are delusional about themselves and cruel to others.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's designed to. I mean, like, you know, we try to escape with whatever humanity we can, but that's what it's designed to do. You know?
Yeah. Matt,
Yeah.
you want to bring some closure to our
Sure.
to our
So the poem I wrote about the current crisis we're living in. We'll see how it applies, how it doesn't. The U.S. has. The U.S. has too many yachts, not enough beds, too many tanks, not enough masks, no supply, all demand the U.S. has. Too many loopholes, not enough homes, too many billionaires, too much private sector, not enough ventilators, no public infrastructure to speak of, too many tax cuts, not enough gloves, far too much to cover up. The richest nation on earth, just as it was designed to be. Unending, unbending, production line of war, famine, disease.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, San, for your question. Thank you, Marta, for your, everybody. I'm sorry. I just, we have more folks. Rafael, I want to, I don't know you, but I want to dedicate the impetus behind my work, my labor power. Rafael, I want to dedicate it to you and to everyone else, of course, as well. I hope that we come to see beyond the computer screen. I like the way you close, Matt. So why don't you close something about locking in or something like that?
All right. So join us again next week. We're gonna keep on digging into Kapital. We're gonna keep reading through this book. There's a treasure trove there for us to really understand the way in which we're the technicalities, the ins and outs of the way in which we're exploited and oppressed. These kind of just broad generalizations, and then we're gonna bring it back home to how these things are really happening in our day-to-day lives. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're going to be doing for the next, for a while. And that's we invite you to join us. And so just because we are locked in doesn't mean we have to be locked out. And remember, physical distance, not social distance. So see you again here next week.
Chingón.